Word that SAR government will lead political reform consultation. Permitted rate of return for local power companies to stay unchanged. And Paris police arrest a shooting spree suspect.
Good evening. Two top mainland officials of the Basic Law Committee began their three-day visit to Hong Kong today. They met with Secretary for Justice Rim-Kee-Yoon this afternoon and talked about the territory's constitutional reform. Yoon said afterwards the SAR government will lead the consultation work. Jenny Lam reports.
Protesters waited for the two Beijing officials, Basic Law Committee Chairman Li Fei and Vice Chairman Zhang Rongshen, outside the Queensway Government Offices building. Li explained that he deals with legal issues and is now focused on the basic law. That's why he has been in touch with Hong Kong's legal sector over the past few years. He met with Secretary for Justice Rim-Kee-Yoon this afternoon. Yoon tried to allay fears that Beijing will dominate Hong Kong's political reform agenda.
Although, of course, in the entire constitutional reform, the central government, of course, has a constitutional role and duty, has a constitutional role to play, as well as a constitutional duty to discharge. But the consultation work would be led by the Hong Kong government.
Chief Secretary for Administration Carrie Lam denied today that the purpose of the Beijing officials' visit is to limit the constitutional reform discussion. Universal suffrage in the 2017 chief executive election, she said, is the common goal of Beijing, the SAR government and the people of Hong Kong. It is not a question of whether their discussions must be held within the framework of the Basic Law, but simply that the legal basis for the election method must comply with the Basic Law and the decision of the National People's Congress Standing Committee. She added that the government will not put forward any concrete proposals for the 2017 chief executive election or the 2016 Legislative Council election during these preliminary discussions. She explained that Li Fei and Zhang Rongshen are here to talk about the relationship between the Basic Law and Hong Kong's political system from a legal point of view. Li and Zhang will attend a luncheon hosted by the Chief Secretary at Government House tomorrow. Among the more than 100 guests are Hong Kong members of the Basic Law Committee, Chambers of Commerce and think tank representatives, plus 7 legislators. Carrie Lam denied that certain lawmakers are being deliberately excluded. The government, she said, will listen to the views of legislators who will be absent tomorrow once consultation on constitutional reform begins. Jenny Lam, TVB News.
Pan-Democrats feel as though they've been deliberately sidelined while Li Fei has been in town. They say if Beijing truly wishes to consult the Legislative Council on constitutional reform, it shouldn't do so on a selective basis. Joel De Silva has that story.
Members of the Alliance for True Democracy are not happy with the arrangements for the three-day visit by Basic Law Committee Chairman Li Fei and Vice Chairman Zhang Rongshen. They feel the visit is an important opportunity for dialogue and that their camp is being intentionally left out.
We are very disappointed with the existing arrangements. We believe that at least these two gentlemen should arrange to meet all legislators who represent the entire electorate of the community. We hope that this is not going to be a one-sided dialogue.
Cheng also expressed concerns the central government might simply announce its position on the reform process in an attempt to constrain the consultation process in Hong Kong. Legislator Alan Leung accused Chief Secretary for Administration Carrie Lam of political bias and of not fulfilling her duties as head of the SAR task force charged with arranging the consultation process on political reform. But despite having been largely sidelined during Li Fei's visit, the Alliance for True Democracy points out that when the time comes to make a final decision on constitutional reform, all legislators and not just some will have their say.
Well, ultimately, we understand the Legislative Council still has a role to play. Any reform proposal must still go through the Legislative Council.
João da Silva, TVB News.
The government and the city's two power companies have agreed to maintain the permitted rate of return at 9.99% for the next 5 years. But academics say if the rate stays the same, CLP Power is expected to raise its electricity charges by 4 to 5% next year. Ronnie Samtani reports.
The Energy Advisory Committee met with Hong Kong's power suppliers this afternoon to review regulations and to discuss whether there is room to improve transmission and electricity rates over the next 5 years. CLP Power, Hong Kong Electric, and the authorities finally agreed to maintain the permitted annual return of 9.99% on their net fixed assets for 5 more years. On top of that, the power companies have promised to set up funds to encourage consumers to save energy. However, William Chung, director of City University's Energy and Environmental Policy Research Unit, says if the permitted rate of return for both companies remains unchanged, it will lead to a rise in electricity prices. Next year, CLP will be developing gas pipelines at the Kai Tak redevelopment site. Chung explained that CLP's infrastructure development costs will cause tariff increases of 1 to 2% every year. He added that natural gas prices have seen steep increases, while coal prices have dropped by 15 to 18% since the start of the year. Based on this, Chung believes CLP's electricity prices will increase by 4 to 5%, while Hong Kong Electric will rise by 0.5 to 1%. It is expected that tariff increases will be announced next year. Ronnie Samtani, TVB News.
A U.S. congressional panel says China's rapid military buildup is altering the strategic balance of power in the Asia-Pacific. It says unless Washington maintains its security commitments, China will have more warships in the region than the United States. Tony Sabine reports.
Once again, U.S. lawmakers sought to impress upon Washington that China is building up its military to challenge American power. A U.S. congressional panel said overnight that by the end of the decade, Beijing could possess the largest fleet of submarines and combatant ships in the Western Pacific. The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission says China's military modernization is altering the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific region. Still, given the U.S. Navy has more aircraft carriers than any other country and has just inaugurated a new class of carrier, which is the most sophisticated ever built, the warning seems like a case of using the China scare card to keep the money flowing into America's vast military machine. Indeed, the panel's primary recommendation is that Congress put more money into shipbuilding and help the Navy increase its operational presence in the Asia-Pacific. It also warned China was advancing its space capabilities and could be capable of taking out American military satellites. But the advisory body expressed concern the U.S. Defense Department would be unable to follow through on these recommendations due to budget cutbacks and security commitments elsewhere. All this ties in neatly with U.S. President Barack Obama's pivot to the Asia-Pacific, a move seen in Beijing as a way to contain China. The group's annual report also looked at cyber intrusions from China, bilateral trade and relationships, and Beijing's global ties. Tony Sabine, TVB News.
After a 2-day nationwide manhunt, Paris police arrested a suspect in Monday's shooting spree that saw a newspaper photographer seriously wounded. And as Alan Booknia reports, the man arrested spent 4 years in jail after being convicted on being an accomplice in another high-profile shooting back in 1994.
The man was arrested in a car park 10 kilometers north of Paris. A witness reported to police that someone resembling pictures of the suspect broadcast on television had stayed at his house in recent days. Police said the suspect was drugged when he was arrested, and it appeared he was attempting to kill himself. He's been identified as Abdel Hakim Dakar, seen here in a surveillance photo in a Paris subway station. Police believe Dakar is the man seen on closed-circuit television coming into the offices of a Paris television station and threatening employees with a pump-action shotgun. 3 days later, a man with a shotgun walked into the offices of a left-wing newspaper. The assailant shot a freelance photographer in the chest, then fled the scene and later fired at least 3 more shots into the lobby of the bank Société Générale in a Paris suburb. He later hijacked a car and forced the driver to take him to central Paris. Dakar spent 4 years in prison in connection with a 1994 robbery and car chase. An ensuing shootout with the police left 5 people dead, including 3 Paris police officers. Dakar was convicted of buying the gun for the couple involved in the shootout. Police said Wednesday they have no motive for Monday's shooting. The photographer shot remains in intensive care. Alan Buknia, TVB News.
The latest round in the Iran nuclear talks got off to a short start in Geneva, with the first meeting ending just minutes after it began. Still, spokesman for Iran and the 6 world powers negotiating indicated a first-step deal is still possible. They called the short first meeting a formality. The sides are trying to negotiate a rollback in Iran's nuclear program in exchange for a lifting of some sanctions against the country. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, voiced support for the negotiations, but he insisted there were limits to the concessions Iran would make for the easing of the sanctions that are choking the country's economy.
The Pakistani schoolgirl, who now stands as a symbol of resistance to the Taliban's efforts to deny women education, was given this year's Human Rights Award by the European Union. Malala Yousafzai accepted the honor with yet another impassioned plea for child education.
16-year-old Malala Yousafzai received the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought at a ceremony in Strasbourg. Upon accepting the EU's top human rights award, Malala continued earning her Education for Everyone advocacy reputation. She urged the 28-nation bloc to help the millions of children who are denied a formal education.
The powerful country shall not be judged by counting its soldiers and navy, but rather we must see which country has the highest literacy rate, which country has more educated people, which country has provided the basic rights to its citizens, which country.
Her all-inspiring words called for a standing ovation, and the European Parliament president thanked her for an extraordinary moment. Trying to stifle her demands for girls' education, the Taliban shot Malala in the head last year, but she shot to fame. The assassination attempt only made her stronger. Such was evidence in July when Malala delivered a passionate speech at the United Nations, where she appealed for free schooling for all children.
Let us pick up our books and our pens. They are our most powerful weapons. One child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world. Education is the only solution. Education first. Thank you.
The $65,000 US prize for freedom of thought has been awarded each year since 1988 to commemorate Soviet scientist and dissident Andrei Sakharov. Its past winners include South Africa's anti-apartheid leader and first black president Nelson Mandela, and Myanmar's democracy advocate and opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi.
2 U.S. presidents laid a memorial wreath at the eternal flame that marks former President John F. Kennedy's gravesite 50 years after he was assassinated. Barack Obama, his wife, and Bill Clinton joined Ethel Kennedy and other family members of JFK's brother Robert Kennedy, who is buried nearby. The commemoration of John F. Kennedy continued at the White House, where a star-studded gathering took place to recognize those receiving America's highest civilian honor. It was JFK who created the Presidential Medal of Freedom right before he was assassinated. Among 15 others, this year's recipients include Bill Clinton, TV talk show host Oprah Winfrey, and women's rights activist Gloria Steinem. And still ahead in our newscast, tighter restrictions for Mongkok pedestrian-only zone. Government to get more shops to join baby formula coupon scheme. And an undersea volcanic eruption in Japan.